In this presentation, I'll be exploring the character of Macbeth in Shakespeare's great tragedy, looking at the way in which the character changes throughout the play, and thinking about how Shakespeare uses the character to explore ideas such as ambition, greed, power, kingship, and what he wants us to learn about the nature of human nature itself. Before we start looking at the character himself, it's important to consider the context in which the play is set and first written. It is a patriarchal society in which men hold all the power and women are largely excluded from it. Macbeth's Scotland is a world where courage, which sometimes comes in the form of violence, and loyalty are rewarded. There is a belief in the great chain of being, the idea that God has determined our position on earth. Our role on earth is given to us and should be maintained. That includes the role of king, and that is where the idea of the divine right of kings come in. It was strongly believed that the king, the reigning monarch, was God's representative on earth, was God's rightful choice. And we have a king at the time the play is first performed in James I, and an audience who may believe in the power of witchcraft. And that's important in terms of our understanding of the play. Macbeth is first introduced to us through other characters in Act 1, Scene 2. The captain comes off the battlefield and informs Duncan about Macbeth's actions. Brave Macbeth, he calls him, for well he deserves that name. Macbeth has, with Banquo, just won the battle for Scotland, defeated the Norwegian army. And the captain goes on to describe Macbeth's bravery, but it is bravery in terms of violence, whose brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution. Here the notion of the sword smoking reveals to us the urgency, determination and vigour with which Macbeth has fought. His bloodthirstiness becomes clear to us in the idea that he met his foe and unseamed him from the nave to the chaps, cut him open right down the middle. Although this is without doubt an act of loyalty and an act of bravery, it reveals to us the lengths Macbeth is willing to go to win. We first meet Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 3, and he meets the witches on the heath. Macbeth's first lines in the play are, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." This is particularly interesting as it completely mirrors the witches' line from the opening scene. Foul is fair and fair is foul. And an audience is led to believe immediately that Macbeth is perhaps in some way influenced by the supernatural, influenced by the witches. At the very least, he is aligned with the witches in some way. The witches, as we know, go on to make the prediction that Macbeth will become Thane of Cawdor and then king. What is most interesting here is the way in which Macbeth reacts to the witches' prophecies. "Speak, I charge you," he says, "and stay, you imperfect speakers, tell me more." Here, Macbeth's use of imperative verbs such as speak, stay, tell, reveal to us his urgency to know more. And in doing so, Macbeth reveals to us his innate ambition for the first time. Here is a man who has a thirst for knowledge about what he might become. In contrast is Banquo, who also receives prophecies. Banquo is important in this scene because his relative lack of ambition reveals to us that ambition is within us all, but it is the way we handle it which is important. Interestingly, Macbeth refers to the speakers, the witches, as imperfect. He recognises their wrongdoing, but he still wants to know more. And in fact, it becomes increasingly clear throughout the play that the witches are not imperfect speakers. They merely make predictions. On occasions, they reveal the truth. It is Macbeth who is an imperfect listener. He takes from their prophecies what he wants to hear, and that is what drives him to his later actions in the play. Also in Act 1, Scene 3, following the prophecies, Macbeth starts to deliver to us as an audience the first of many asides in this play. In these asides, he is talking only to the audience. The other characters on stage cannot hear him. And in this first aside, he reveals to us his inner thoughts. Two truths are told as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. Key here is the notion of prologue. This is only a starting point, and Macbeth reveals to us in that word that the main narrative is yet to come. That narrative, he suggests, is the swelling act of the imperial theme. Swelling suggesting this act is going to grow and grow. The imperial theme, of course, is his acquisition of the crown, and it reveals to us his immediate desire to realise the witch's prophecy that he will become king. Macbeth realises straight away that in order to become king, the existing King Duncan must be removed. He refers to the potential murder of Duncan as the horrid image, and this is the first time in the play that Macbeth uses a euphemism for the murder. He cannot ever bring himself in this play, before he murders Duncan, to actually name it murder itself. He continues to use euphemisms as if he's trying to avoid the point. He doesn't quite have the courage to face up to it. He reveals that the image of the murder will make his seated heart knock at his ribs. His heart is beating fast, and this has two interpretations. The first one is that he is fearful, he is afraid. Our heart beats fast when we are afraid. But not only this, our heart also beats fast when we are excited. And I think here Macbeth is fearful and excited in equal measure at the prospect of murdering the king. In a second aside, Macbeth reveals to the audience the depth of his inner evil. He says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." Macbeth talks to the stars here, often seen as a symbol of the heavens. So in some sense, he is talking about God here, and what he wants to hide from God is his black and deep desires, those inner urges to commit murder, those inner urges to commit evil acts. So not only does he reveal his evil here, but he reveals his fear of God's judgment for the first time. He wants to hide his act from the judgment of God, because he knows in murdering Duncan, he is going against the great chain of being and against God's will. Subsequently to that, Macbeth writes to his wife, Lady Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth takes this message from Macbeth, and she decides that she is going to be the impetus that Macbeth needs. She is going to manipulate him and persuade him to commit the act that is necessary for him to become king. At the start of Act 1, Scene 7, despite his wife's urgings and his wife's manipulation, Macbeth reveals, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other." So Macbeth reveals to us explicitly, for the first time, that he has the ambition to become king. but what he lacks, perhaps, is the courage to do it. He has no spur, no way to make himself go forward and commit the crime. It's up to us to decide what that spur might be. Of course, it could be his wife, Lady Macbeth. It might also be the prophecies of the witches in which Macbeth has so much belief. The pinnacle of Macbeth's indecision, if we like, is in Act 2, Scene 1, when he visualises the dagger. He is hallucinating. Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand? On the one hand, the hallucination might make it seem as if Macbeth is loaded with doubt. But in the next line, "Come, let me clutch thee," we see Macbeth's clear intent. If the dagger is a symbol of his desire to commit murder, here he is suggesting that he has the urge and the determination to do it. Or art thou but a dagger of the mind, a false creation, proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain? He is still flicking back and forwards between certainty and doubt. He cannot trust himself entirely. I see thee yet in form as palpable as this which now I draw. But that certainty begins to grow when he reveals that the dagger marshals me the way that I was going. He sees the dagger as the spur that he needs, the direction that he needs to commit the murder. But what he also does here is he takes the blame away from himself and puts it on to the hallucination of the dagger itself. It is the dagger which is leading him towards the murder. The doubt continues, but then he begins to see something else. And on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. The blood, of course, is the blood of Duncan, so he is visualising the murder, perhaps for the first time. He sees the act of murder and the aftermath. But of course, as we will learn throughout the presentation, blood throughout Macbeth is also a symbol of guilt. So Macbeth not only foresees the committing of the crime here, he also sees the guilt that will come from that. And that is what causes the doubt to creep in again. There's no such thing. It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes. Towards the end of this soliloquy, he reveals again his fear of judgment. Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps. Here Macbeth is afraid of the earth hearing him, perhaps also afraid that God will hear him commit this crime. And so the doubt continues until a bell rings. The bell, of course, is Lady Macbeth. She tells him earlier in the play that she will ring a bell when everything is set up for Macbeth to commit the murder. And as soon as that bell rings, he switches from doubt to absolute certainty. I go and it is done. The bell invites me. So it is Lady Macbeth who provides the trigger for Macbeth to go and commit the crime. But again, Macbeth looks to put the blame on others. The bell invites me, as if it is not his own decision to go and commit this crime, but somebody else's. Between Act 2 Scene 1 and Act 2 Scene 2, Macbeth commits the murder of Duncan, and Act 2 Scene 2 reveals to us the aftermath of the murder. Macbeth comes onto the stage covered in blood. His hands are covered in blood. And his reaction to what he has just done is fascinating. First of all, he says that "Amen stuck in my throat." Here, again, this religious reference reveals Macbeth's fear of God's judgment. He cannot say amen. He is too terrified to do so. He knows that he has disrupted God's natural order. He has disrupted the great chain of being. He then starts speaking in the third person, as if he's lost all sense of who he is. Perhaps again he's trying to divert blame away from himself and onto another being. He says Macbeth does murder sleep, and this is one of many, many references to sleep that we get from this point on. Of course, sleep is the human body's way of restoring itself to its former state. So what Macbeth reveals to us here is that he will never sleep again. He will never be able to return to the man he was before. Nothing will ever be the same again. But it's not just Macbeth. Nobody in this play will ever be the same again. And indeed, Scotland will never be the same again. And then Macbeth delivers the great line, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hands?" And in this desperate question, Macbeth reveals to us his guilt. Blood, as has already been said, is a symbol of guilt in this play. And by referencing the god of the oceans, Macbeth reveals to us that he knows he will never be rid of this guilt. All the water in the world could not wash this blood from his hands. He will forever be living the consequences of what he has done. What's most interesting perhaps in this scene is the contrast we see between Macbeth's reaction and the reaction of his wife. Whereas Macbeth is overcome by what he has done, Lady Macbeth appears completely cold and detached. "Consider it not so deeply," she says to her husband. And whereas Macbeth has referenced the god of the seas, all the water in the world will not clean him of this guilt, Lady Macbeth suggests that a little water clears us of this deed. If she feels any remorse at all, it is hardly there and easily removed. And she reveals to her husband, "My hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white." She reveals to him that she knows she is as guilty as him, but she also has the courage to overcome it. And her shame in Macbeth's reaction is once again another way in which she dominates and emasculates her husband. But the plan has worked and Macbeth becomes king. He is crowned in between Act 2, Scene 2 and what we see here in Act 3, Scene 1. But Macbeth is not a happy king. He cannot relax. Our fears in Banquo stick deep, and in his royalty of nature reigns that which would be feared. Now, of course, Macbeth fears Banquo because of the witch's prophecies. As well as predicting that Macbeth would become king, they also predicted that Banquo would be father to a line of kings. His sons would be kings of Scotland. What this reveals to Macbeth is that he will not produce a son that will be king. He will not be able to cement his legacy. And that is why he fears Banquo, why the fear in Banquo goes so deep to his very heart. The other thing he appears to fear in Banquo is Banquo's royalty of nature. Banquo has the kingly qualities that Macbeth lacks. Macbeth knows he is not a rightful king. He is not God's chosen king, and he lacks the qualities of loyalty and compassion that we saw in Duncan and that we see in Banquo. And for that reason he starts to see his kingship as pointless. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown and put a barren sceptre in my gripe. The sceptre and the crown here are symbols of kingship. And for Macbeth they are pointless because he knows, firstly, he is not the rightful king, and secondly, he cannot produce an heir which will cement his legacy as a royal family. In Act 3, Scene 2, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth engage in conversation, and we start to see a shift in the dynamic of their relationship. Whereas earlier in the play, Lady Macbeth has subverted gender expectation, she has taken on the dominant role in this relationship. Now, as king, Lady Macbeth steps aside and allows Macbeth to dominate to a larger degree. Macbeth suggests that they must make our faces visards to our hearts, but actually in trying to dominate here, Macbeth actually undermines himself. He starts to mirror the language of his wife from earlier in the play. She told him to look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. And Macbeth reveals the doubt that he is still suffering from. Oh, full of scorpions is my mind. His mind is a restless place and a poisonous place. Then in Act 3, Scene 4, we get the great banquet scene. And what happens in the banquet scene is that Banquo's ghost returns and starts to haunt Macbeth. Macbeth starts to see Banquo's ghost around the banquet table. None of the other characters, of course, on stage can see it. And he refers to Banquo as horrible shadow. A shadow because Banquo will follow Macbeth. The memory of Banquo will follow Macbeth for the rest of his life, because Banquo is a constant reminder, not just of what Macbeth has done, the horrible crimes he has committed, but Banquo is a constant reminder to Macbeth of what it means to be a king, how to be a king in every sense. But at the end of the scene, Macbeth takes control again, and he delivers the very sinister line, "We are but young indeed." And in that line he reveals to us that the murder of Duncan and the murder of Banquo is just the beginning. Things are about to get much more bloody and much more sinister. And at this point of doubt, it is not to his wife that Macbeth returns. Significantly, it is to the witches that Macbeth returns for reassurance. And in doing so, it reveals to the audience that perhaps it is the witches who are a more significant influence on Macbeth in this play than Lady Macbeth is. Significantly, as Macbeth approaches the witches, one of them reveals, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes." Now, the tingling of the thumb was seen as a sign of oncoming evil. This is significant. Even the witches now, a symbol of malevolent evil in this play, are sensing Macbeth's evil. He has sunk even lower than the witches, and it foreshadows the horrors of the evil to come. The witches reveal to Macbeth a series of apparitions. The first apparition is a helmeted head, a beheaded warrior, if you like. The second is a bloodied child, or a child born by caesarean section. And the third is a crowned child with a tree bringing the forest to Macbeth. The helmeted head, of course, is Macbeth's own head, the warrior who is beheaded at the end of the play. The bloodied child is Macduff. It is later revealed that Macduff is not by woman born. He was from his mother's womb untimely plucked. And the crowned child with a tree is Malcolm, bringing the forest to Macbeth. So what the witches actually do is to reveal to Macbeth the future. They predict the future for him. But this is where we really learn that Macbeth is the imperfect listener. Because what he takes from this is the idea that no man of woman born can harm Macbeth. He takes from this the idea that he is now, in some ways, immortal. Nobody can touch him. So he takes the truth and he twists it into what he wants to hear, and in what will give him confidence going forward. And in doing so, Shakespeare reveals to us the nature of ambition. If you allow it to run away with you, it will start to cloud your judgment and change your perception of what is real. And it is that warning against excessive ambition and greed which is so central to Shakespeare's message in the play. By Act 5, Scene 3, we see Macbeth holed up in his castle, and Malcolm and Macduff have assembled an army together with the English to come and overthrow him. But Macbeth remains a warrior to the very last. Fear not, Macbeth, no man that's born of woman shall e'er have power upon thee. He is spurred on by the witch's predictions, but of course here he misquotes the witches again, which reveals to us that he is the imperfect listener. He has not heard what they have predicted for him. He has taken his own meaning from it. But he is undaunted in his decision to fight on. I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked. He is determined. He is a warrior to the very last. However, his warriorship has changed. It is now entirely selfish and entirely self-indulgent, whereas before his brutality was in the name of the king and in the name of Scotland. Now it is in his name only. In Act 5, Scene 5, it is revealed to Macbeth that his wife has died. Lady Macbeth, overcome by grief and guilt and paranoia, goes insane and takes her own life. And we get this wonderful moment of reflection from Macbeth in amongst all the brutality and violence and determination. He pauses for a moment to reflect. She should have died hereafter. There would have been time for such a word. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Here Macbeth is reflecting on the futility of life. It has ceased to mean anything to him. He has a fascination with time here. He mentions tomorrow. He mentions time. He mentions an hour upon the stage. It seems as if Macbeth is now fascinated with time because at last he has become aware of his own mortality. In some ways at this moment he accepts his fate. The reference to a stage, life as a stage, and all of us as players, as actors upon that stage, is a common motif in Shakespeare's plays, and it seems significant. It seems as if Macbeth has realised that we all just play a part, that what he has done has been predetermined for him. So in some way there is an acceptance of his fate, but there is also a rejection of any blame for what he's done. It is as if somebody else has determined this part for him, and he will see it through to its natural conclusion. So Macbeth is a character that Shakespeare uses to reveal to us how natural a feeling ambition is. But he also reveals through Macbeth how ambition, when mismanaged, can become dangerous and destructive. This is important, of course, because the play comes at a time just in the aftermath of the Gunpowder Plot, an attempt on the king's life by ambitious individuals. So Shakespeare writes this to appease his king and patron, James I, to reveal to his audience the danger of greed and excessive ambition. He also reveals to us the true nature of kingship and what can go wrong if kingship is exploited for individual and selfish purposes.